episode of DarshanTalks. I am your host, Darshan Kulkarni. I'm an attorney. I'm a pharmacist. I advise companies with FDA-regulated matters. So if you are a person who works in a licensed company or an FDA-regulated company, or you have an interest in its products, this is the podcast for you. So today's podcast is actually about how do you work with a lot of the providers, and what are the issues that pop up in the context of working with providers. And if you're an MSL, if you are in sales, if you have always been curious about what are the inner workings of these types of providers, we have a treat for you, because our guest is an attorney. She has a master's in public health. She works with these providers and helps partner with the C-suite to build thriving and sustainable companies. She is the CCO and Senior VP of HR for a multi-state, multi-jurisdictional healthcare practice. And our guest today, and full disclosure, a person who went to law school with me, Kate Woods. Thank you for coming on, Kate.
Thanks, Darshan, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So this is really interesting to me because everyone, from the perspective of people in pharma, this is often a little bit of a dark hole. You've worked a lot with providers. Can you talk a little bit about your experiences? What are the types of formats or the types of providers you've worked with, and what are their general perspectives on working with pharma or with other providers?
Okay, so I've worked with providers across a broad swath of healthcare industries and roles, both at a national pharmacy. As you mentioned, I'm currently in-house at a multi-state dermatology practice. I have served as outside counsel to small practices, from solo practitioners to a multi-state dental organization. So I've really run the gamut around legal guidance, regulatory guidance, employment law, things of that, both inside and outside for healthcare practices in various positions. I also did a stint at a healthcare insurance company. And so I think that gives you a really well-rounded perspective on how healthcare really works in this country. My experience with providers, and I've worked with doctors, advanced practice practitioners, nurses, pharmacists. They, as you know, take their careers and their patients very seriously. And what they want to do is they want to practice. They want to do the things they went to medical school for. They went to pharmacy school for. They went to nursing school for. They do not want to necessarily be bogged down in the administrative aspects of things. And so they expect their partners on that front to be as committed and as experienced and as serious about the knowledge needed to provide excellent care as they are, which is like the number one fundamental way to build trust with them, is that they know when they put themselves in your hands that they're safe and they're confident in your own capabilities. And it works.
So when you're talking, when you're talking, and we've got a lot of listeners who happen to be pharmacists, so I might talk a little bit more about them. But the general principles still apply across the different healthcare providers. What do you think are the biggest places where a startup who's trying to build a practice, whether it's pharmacy, whether it's a medical practice, what are they generally having a blind spot to? And that you come in and you go, you know what, this is what you aren't considering. This is what we need to fix first.
Yeah. You know, I'm not sure so much that it's a blind spot as not an area of expertise. So again, we're talking about people who've devoted their lives to learning a medical profession or learning how to practice in pharmacy. They've devoted their lives to specializing in that. They did not go to law school. They did not become a certified healthcare human resource professional. They weren't interested in that, but they recognize that in order to build a sound and stable practice or company, they need that piece. So they will bring me in. They'll say, I know I'm in a highly regulated field. I know I need to be compliant. I'm interested in being compliant. I'm not interested in being the compliance officer. Help me build the department. How does the program work? So I wouldn't say blind spot, more as I have found medical professionals to be very adept at understanding, here's my field of strength and here's a field of strength that I need. And they are not shy or hesitant to bring in the people they need to do that.
So that's interesting. You talk about the importance of trusting the people you work with, and you talk about the importance of building the department. So what are the most common mistakes you see in how the department gets built? How do you sort of start even attacking that problem?
Yeah. So I've built and rebuilt several departments and programs through the years at various organizations, again, both from the inside and the outside. And I think the most important, when I think about it, to start the foundations, it may be a cliche, but people are first. You've got to get the right people on your team. That doesn't always mean the most experienced. It means the person most willing and passionate to be involved in your build, and people who are going to adopt and really cheerlead your vision. Second, and immediately second, is processes. Without proper standard operating procedures, workflows, and a clear understanding across and up and down the hierarchy on how a process works, in my experience, I have found you can have the smartest, brightest, most committed team. And if you have failed in your job to give them a common framework from which to practice and which to build, it will fail. It may not fail on the short term, but it will fail in the long term. And then always culture is important. People and processes, but without culture, nothing works. And you'll often hear people say culture. What does culture mean? Well, to me, what culture means is culture is what sustains us through crises. And when we look at the past year with COVID-19, you can really see where strong cultures separated the okay companies from the companies that are going to thrive and survive through the next year and maybe the next decade. And so culture takes us through crises, but it's also what jazzes us up in the good times. And again, it's a common language that, people speak on the team. And that's really what companies and departments are. They're teams. And people who would say otherwise, I think, have maybe not worked in a department or a company for any long period of time.
So
I hope that answered your...
It did. So you point out to three separate pieces. You talk about people, you talk about process, you talk about culture. Let's start with the first one. You talk about people, and you talk about you want people to basically be the greatest cheerleader for your mission, if you will. It reminded me a little bit of, are you a movie buff at all?
I'm sorry?
Are you a movie buff?
Oh, I love movies. I love stories. Okay. I'm a lawyer. Okay. We all love stories.
Have you seen the movie Moneyball?
I did not see Moneyball, but I know about it. Yeah.
Okay. So the concept in Moneyball is basically you don't necessarily need the best people who are good at everything. You need the people who are right for the job that you're trying to accomplish. And it's a basic numbers game, which was unheard of in baseball, but it seems to have changed baseball. My question for you is, what is the Moneyball equivalent of building a team? How do you begin to come to, is this the right team for me? And what I mean by that is having someone be your greatest cheerleader is great, but that's not enough. So what is it that you look for as a core competency to go from there?
That's a great question. The first thing I think in building a strong team that's the right team is understanding your own strengths and weaknesses and understanding your company's or your business's needs. One of my CEOs first of all, let me say, I have had the privilege to work with really visionary and strong CEO leaders in many of the iterations of my career. It's been a true blessing. One of them, they all had their different strengths and weaknesses, but this particular CEO was a person I learned so much from, in that he was so confident in his own area of expertise that he was not intimidated or shy in any way to say, I don't know this piece. The best person for that is the person who does. They're not going to diminish me. They're going to bolster me. They're going to, right? So using the baseball analogy, if I'm a great pitcher, the next thing I need is a great catcher. I might at some point need a backup pitcher, but what I really need is someone who can read my signals and vice versa, and catch what I'm throwing.
So I love how we're having a sports discussion. I know nothing about sports, just to be very clear about this.
Yeah. So when I look to build a team, I start with, where do I know I have strengths and where do I know I have weaknesses? And what in this moment and for the foreseeable future, you look out 5-10 years, what does the company need? So the company's here today, we have X skill. The company needs to be at another stage in 2 years. What skills am I missing? And beyond that, where do we want the company to go in 10 years? What skills will I need then? And I build that team accordingly. So I think the most important thing, though, is to dissect that and understand those things. But most importantly, again, from that lesson I learned, you cannot be afraid of someone else's strength. I do think sometimes professionally, we've all run into people who are more interested in making themselves look good than building what's needed for the company. And sometimes people believe that in order to do that, they need to hide someone else's skill set or capabilities. And I preach this to everyone I come across. That is such a fundamentally wrong way to view how to succeed in business or, frankly, life. I have been very successful in identifying top talent in areas where our companies have needed it, whether it be payroll or credentialing or the compliance department or the HR generalist role, a plethora of recruiting, all of those things. Those are not per se my strongest areas of professional competency. My strongest area would be legal and guidance and strategic thinking. But I'm not afraid to say, we have this need and we've found this person with this expertise, and I'm going to let her shine, and I'm going to let her build this unit or build this section of it. And, you work closely and you make sure that those people are sticking with the company's strategic vision, but you cannot be afraid that your team members will shine or outshine you, because if you're doing it right, they will, and you will be there, applauding them and saying, yes, my vision built this strong unit.
So that's a really interesting perspective, right? What you're talking about is trusting yourself, and you're talking about evaluating their needs, strengths, weaknesses. But I guess my question is, that starts with what you effectively described as a gap analysis. Here's where we are today. Here's where we want to go. That's great if you have a starting point. If you're a startup, you need everything. So how do you begin there?
You do. Well, you do need everything. And I would say it's still a gap analysis. You need to know, I may need everything, but what do I need today? And I'll give you a perfect example in my own career. I've worked at several startups and also mid-size companies, that have grown from 2 people to 7 to, ultimately 1,000 or more employees. At some point through my career in-house, when I've been brought in to serve in the chief compliance officer role, I am maybe phase 2.5 or phase 3. companies don't bring in the compliance officer on day one. On day one, they
Right.
bring in the CEO.
Right.
He or she is there. You need a COO. We're in healthcare, so we'll say oftentimes you need a chief medical officer or chief pharmacy officer. They bring those roles in because they know I'm not going to be able to service my patients or my clients
Right.
if I don't have these critical roles filled.
Right.
Then, as it becomes more complex, they say, oh, you know what? I can't really handle. I've branched out from one store in one city in one state to, now I'm in 3 states. Now I'm in 4 states. I can no longer handle the legal and regulatory components with only outside counsel and my very smart pharmacist or doctor who knows some law. And then they say, okay, now I need a chief compliance officer. So I don't think that they didn't recognize the value and need of compliance at day one. Of course they did, but they knew that that would be a need they filled later after they had built the core structure of how to run the business. So I think the gap analysis still stands. I'm doing the gap analysis, and this is what I need this week, and this is what I need in 1 to 2. And does the person I identify in 1 to 2, can that carry us through in 5 to 10? Or do I need to also be aware of, and after we have this role filled and we've grown to X, what's the next stage, and do I want to be pulling in for that? And I think the smart, companies that make it and are successful are always thinking in those terms: short term, intermediate term, long term. But you do have to have the ability to adapt because depending on where you take your business, your needs may change.
So that really brings us to the next question, which is having a common culture. And can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So when you're talking about having a common culture, how do you even begin to characterize what your culture is, to identify what's common about it, and therefore what team members fit into it?
Yeah. Great question. In my experience, culture really develops 2 ways. And oftentimes people will think it develops solely from the top, and the top is super important, but we're humans, and humans are organic. So you can have what you say is your culture on paper, and then you can have your real culture. And the best companies nail it on both sides. I'll share another story. I came to a company, all companies have new employee onboarding, they have orientation, all of those things. I came to one company, we did an orientation. After about 2 weeks at the company, I went to the person responsible for orientation, and I said to her, I have never, in all of my years at different companies, been at a place that so accurately captures its culture in onboarding new employees. Everything you said is true about this place. And that was at 2 weeks in. And you could say, well, what about 3 weeks in or 6 months in? And I will tell you, 3 weeks, 6 months, several years in, it remained the same. And why I think that company was so successful at culture is because it invested not an insignificant time in understanding who the company really was and what were the core values that the CEO insisted on. And then they put the effort into the orientation on that to make sure they accurately communicated it. And I will give you an example from that company that both came from the top up and then organically pulled in from the bottom up because people bought into the culture. One of the most important things to that CEO was that everyone at the company was there to do the right thing. Whatever that meant in their role, you should never do the wrong thing for the right reason, and you shouldn't do the right thing for the wrong reason. You were there to do the right thing, and you also should always assume positive intent from your fellow coworkers and from patients and clients. And that was drilled down from day one from this gentleman. It was so important to him. It was how he lived, and he wanted his company to be an expression of that. And we would hire for those traits. You ask certain questions. There are all kinds of really cool techniques when you're hiring people, as you know, to really probe into their answers and responses. And while we always look for technical expertise, we needed to know it was very important to you that doing the right thing was important, whether you got credit for it or not, or whether it was really part of your role or your job, that if you saw something that wasn't being done correctly, that you would step in and make it right. And then assuming positive intent was all about making it an environment that wasn't toxic. And I think we've all worked, probably sadly, in places that were more or less toxic than others. And the best places to work are places that don't have toxicity. And we hired, not always successfully, but most of the time, we hired looking for traits that showed what people were interested in was working together in a collaborative and friendly capacity, and that people had enough trust in one another to assume that, say, Darshan, we were colleagues and we were working on a project and I made a mistake or I didn't give a deliverable that you needed. We were looking for people who would not immediately say, Kate tried to sabotage me, or she was out to get me, or Kate doesn't care about her job. We were looking for people who would say, well, I know Kate. She usually is really competent in her role. I know she cares about this company. Let me stop and ask her what happened and how we can fix this mistake. And so we're looking for people who would reach out, and you would, in that example, you would call me up and say, hey, Kate, this isn't like you. What's happened here? And I would have an honest conversation. And maybe I would say something like, well, I just have had a really tough month with COVID-19 and taking the kids' schooling on and thinking, I'm really apologize, but this is what happened. And you work that out. And it's just a better company to work at. And it builds on itself. So it's a little bit long-winded, but I would say it's top and bottom. But the people who run the company need to know who they are. And then you have to be able to have the ability to identify people who also want to share and express those values.
Which I think is really interesting, because when you talk about finding the people who share those common values, what you really implicitly described is the idea that people trust each other. And my question for you is, how do you, when people are coming on, it's really difficult for them to trust you. They don't know you. So you've got to create a culture where trust is not just generated over time, because sometimes you don't have the time to build that. So how do you create that within the actual onboarding process, that your team members are on your side? So what are some things you've looked at or seen?
Well, I think to your point, trust is something you build over time. But from the role and responsibility of bringing new team members into any organization, I think the first thing you need to do is, when identifying talent, it's really important to identify, do they either have the prior experience in this specific role and a proven track record, or do they have enough analogous transitional experience in something else that I believe with the proper training and onboarding, they can be a successful team member. And, to build trust, as in any relationship at companies and practices, it has to be a two-way street. If I hire you and you need a particular skill, and we've said we'll train you on it, and then we don't, then we've failed in the trust department, because I've not set you up for success. So it's not a one-way street. It's not just how do you prove your trust as a team member. It's how does the company and the practice prove it is also trustworthy and that we say what we mean and we do what we say. So oftentimes, to be very technical for a moment, I think when people are onboarded, uh, sometimes both the company and the employee will believe it's a rote exercise to go through the training. I do not. Uh, in my most successful roles around helping to build departments and programs, we've taken that very seriously. You and I are attorneys. We took law school seriously. Doctors are, providing medical services for critically ill patients every day. They take their training very seriously. I believe it's as important to take your company training and understanding all of the functions that you're responsible for very seriously. It's not a paper exercise, I will say that. And then, we have honeymoon periods for a reason. With the best of intentions, sometimes people don't work out in an organization. We are all human. And that could be for many reasons. It may be that the particular human loved the idea of the company. And when they got into it, they found they were missing something from an old role or experience, and it wasn't a great fit. That doesn't make them a bad person. That means this wasn't a great fit. In the best case scenario, they come, they share that information, and we work to help them transition out and find a replacement for the role. Similarly, we hire somebody on, we think they're going to be fantastic at what they do and a great fit, and we're finding that's not so. The most critically important thing to do there is identify it early enough so that you don't leave somebody to fail or bring down the organization in a role that's not suited for them any longer than necessary. And that can be tough. I think as humans, we often, even the most non-risk averse or assertive of us, are not necessarily looking for conflict. But it's really important to be able to identify someone who's not working out in a role and move them quickly. Because what happens is, if you don't, your other team members lose trust in you because they don't believe you will take the action needed as a leader, and they lose trust in the process. And frankly, they lose enthusiasm, to perform the work. So it's as important to elevate great humans and team members in a role as it is to identify people who just are not a good fit early and often.
By the way, we've got a message from Christine saying that this is an amazing conversation. So thank you, Christine.
Oh, thank you, Christine.
I'm going to ask you one last question before we something different. But you talk about bringing people who share common values, but at the same time, it's important that we bring people who have very disparate perspectives to have the company succeed. In your different roles, how has diversity played a role in bringing a team to success?
Yeah, such a great question, because I do think, again, we're all humans. We often, sometimes, a little bit of a conflict there, often and sometimes, but we will often identify, maybe wrongly, in order for us to have common values, we should look the same or have come from the same training background. And we can be myopic sometimes and not broaden our horizons. And of course, diversity and inclusion right now in 2021 is a huge topic. And I think there's a lot of work going on in corporate America around it. And, hopefully it's sustained, because I think it makes us better. In my own personal experience, I have found what works best for humans and for companies is to be open to everyone who can do the job, and be very careful to be aware of your own particular biases around many things. And it's not just cultural background or skin color. It could be, I only look at people who went to Ivy League schools. That's the only person who can fulfill this role. Now, that's going to do a couple of things. That's going to severely limit your pool. It is also, in many instances, going to correlationally limit your diversity options. And I will speak for myself. I went to an amazing state school, as you know, right? I'm going to do a little plug for Temple Law. Amazing, amazing school. Later in life, I did go back to get a master's in public health, and I was lucky enough to be able to, attend Columbia University. Both great schools, both fantastic schools. Many people are impressed with the Columbia degree, but which I am, loved Columbia. I can't say enough about it. Temple made me. So I'm sure there were jobs I was precluded from because I didn't have the right pedigree. But so I think it's really important to look at a broad array. I also think it's important when you're in a leadership role to make sure that you don't have a closed environment. Who do you know? I make it a point when I am building the areas of companies that I work in, and think about the areas I work in, Darshan. I lead credentialing, human resources, compliance in the past, and I'm sure in the future, I'll continue to have a legal role in many organizations that I advise. Many of those departments require not only internal candidates to hire, but outside vendors and support. So whether it's external legal counsel or a consultant on this project, I have a very broad network, and I don't limit it to people who look like me, who came from the same school I came from, any of those things. And highly professional, experienced, like the best of the best. And I hire for that. But because I have a broad and very diverse network, I'm able to advance a cause that I believe in, which is equitable representation, both internally and external to the company. So I make it a point to hire the most experienced people I can hire, but I also make it a point to say, okay, I don't want my entire outside legal counsel roster to be 35 to 40-year-old white men or women who all went to these top 3 schools. I say, I'm looking at the people I know, who's got the subject matter expertise, who do I think I'm going to work best with? And because I have a broad array of friends and professional colleagues, I can pick the best of the best, and I can make it a point to make sure that my roster is diverse. Same thing for internal candidates. I have never limited myself to, kind of one group of, I'm only talking to white women, right? So right. I'm able, I think, to do the best thing for the company, which is to get a broad and diverse perspective in. And you do have different life perspectives, depending on whether you were born in the country, or you immigrated to the country, or you were born into the upper middle class, or you were working class, or, you're African American, or you're Chinese, or you're Irish, Italian, Catholic. They all offer a different perspective. I will say, I hire for the best. I just make it a point to make sure I know the best from a broad array of backgrounds, because that's how you get diversity of perspective, and that's how you get true excellence.
So obviously we can have this conversation. I have like 5 questions based on what you just said, but we're a little over where we usually aim to be. So we're gonna change this into a different direction. We do a rapid fire round. So usually I ask 10 questions, but I'm gonna give you some respite. We'll aim for 5. Are you ready?
I hope so. My favorite color is green.
We haven't gotten there yet. Favorite color was an option, but that's off the table now.
Okay.
How do you define success?
Being authentic to yourself and helping yourself as well as others.
Okay. When are you most inspired?
Oh, wow. That's a wonderful question. Rapid response. I'm most inspired when I'm out walking in nature.
Okay. What makes you happy?
Family.
Okay. If you were going to build a 2020 Mount Rushmore, who would be the first person on it and why?
Oh, wow. Totally biased and personal. My dad.
I love it. Why? Like, obviously, he's your dad, but what about him?
Yeah. Greatest man I ever met. He was,
Awesome.
and I've met many great men. He was brilliant. He was kind, and he had a true moral compass. Amazing man. Yeah.
Okay. And what is the most important piece of advice you give to your children?
Be loyal and be
Interesting.
honest. Yeah.
Awesome. That was 5, and that was quick. So that very good in the rapid fire. As a guest, you get to give one question for the audience for them to answer. So what question would you like to ask them?
Oh, this is wonderful. I love this. I would like to ask in 2021 how the audience feels about the best way to build a culture within a company and what the true needs are to sustain companies in this, I think, next decade, which will be very different from the decades we just came from.
Absolutely. So during this podcast, Kate, as you know, we landed up talking about what makes for great companies. We talked about the basics of people, process, and culture. We then got into a little bit on trust and diversity as well. We talked a little bit about your perspective on how do you appropriately build teams, and that was an overall general perspective. Did I miss anything important?
This has been great, Darshan. I really enjoyed it. So I don't think so. Thank you.
So just to be clear, because we're both lawyers, we have to say this. Nothing in this podcast should be construed as legal or clinical advice of any kind. It is intended for educational and entertainment purposes only. For those of you who missed it, where can they find you, Kate?
You can find me on LinkedIn, Kate Woods. I am with Schweiger Dermatology Group, so you can Google Schweiger Dermatology Group and find me. And I am also available at katewoods4@gmail.com.
Excellent. And if you like this podcast, please leave a comment, answer Kate's question. Please subscribe. You can find me at DarshanTalks on Twitter or go to our website at DarshanTalks.com. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you, Darshan.